this will be a descriptive analysis on the macroeconomic level, so quite a bit different than what we have seen a lot of these conference presentations. Right, it's on economic inequality or inequalities actually, and the crisis, or actually the crises with an E. There have been several in the last past 2.5 decades in Central, East and Southeastern Europe. The structure of the presentation is as follows. I will say something about the development of the household income inequality in Central and Eastern Europe, in Southeastern Europe, and in the CIS economies. I will focus on the macro imbalances in terms of current account balances, or rather imbalances. First, during the transition crisis, the period of bumpy recovery, late 90s, the Russian crisis, the many banking crises that occurred in the region. Then there will be an excursion on some sort of personal sectoral income inequality in the new member states. Then again, imbalances in the early boom period. And then again an excursion on household wealth and debt distribution in 2 countries for which we have comparable data, Slovakia and Slovenia. And then finally the boom peak and the Great Recession and imbalances in the region. And then finally some summary and conclusions. So here we have the development of Gini indices of disposable household income for Central European economies. And basically what we can observe starting in 1989, that with the transition crisis there was quite an increase of inequality and then some stabilization, maybe even during the boom peak, some little reduction in inequalities, and then again a stabilization basically. So we don't really see something like an inverted U-shaped Kuznets curve type of development, at least yet not. There is within the Central European a group of countries, 2 subgroups, one, the upper one, the Baltic states, to a certain extent also Poland, the lower one, the Central European core countries, one could say, and yeah, also Hungary to a certain extent. Going to the next group of countries, Southeast European countries, there the data is already less comparable. Yeah? So this is not only income, disposable income, household level, but there is also consumption data, so breaks in the series and what have you. And here we rather see, over the whole period, rather a progression of inequality, one could argue. And finally, the CIS economies, here the data is even less comparable, but all what we know is that there was quite an increase, or actually quite high levels in some countries. And during the boom in this area, which was partly connected also to the increases in oil prices, we see some kind of a reversal from high inequality rates. But some of these countries, like the top countries here, Georgia and Russia, we see inequality levels of the type of African countries. While for most of the other countries, we saw an average of inequality which was somewhere around 30 above or below, and that is again the level of inequality you would have on average in the European Union as well. Okay, now you will see several of those figures, scatter plots. I will have on the vertical axis the Gini index for disposable income for different periods, and basically for those countries that are comparable, mostly the new member state countries, basically, for which. And these are averages due to availability for certain periods. And in this case, I plotted against the average real GDP growth in this beginning period of transition, and we can see those countries that experienced the largest drop in this initial transition crisis. Basically, the Baltic countries plus Croatia, these are also the countries that experienced the largest levels of income inequality. Now, especially in this beginning period, it's difficult to say what this income inequality really means, especially if we think about 89, or if for some countries even earlier data exists. In communist economies, it was rather not having, but it was rather an inequality in approaching some consumption goods and services than income inequality. So we don't know exactly how this change was, yeah? But presumably one could argue that with this strong GDP drop, I will show also, I think, unemployment figures, there was also an increase in inequality. Croatia is also up here. The war in the early 1990s was here quite decisive. A bit later, 93, 96, we have this effect of this massive income shock, high unemployment rates, especially in those countries which experienced also a large drop in GDP, but also Bulgaria, Poland, the Baltic economies, again, those countries having high inequality rates, while Czech Republic, for instance, very low unemployment rate, also a very low income inequality rate. How was this reflected in macroeconomic imbalances? We have here now on the horizontal axis the average current account balance. I would say, if anything, one sees something like a U-shaped relationship. Countries with surpluses, countries with huge deficits experienced, but also those countries with higher inequality coefficients, while those countries that had a fairly balanced current account were basically those Czech Republic, Slovakia with lower levels of income inequality. Latvia was still, I think at that time, mid-1990s, struggling with the transition crisis, reduction in consumption, hence also imports having current account surplus. Other countries started to indebt themselves with high current account deficits. Now, an excursion, as I said, all this annual data, not many data points for instance, for further econometric analysis. Therefore, I tried to actually do something about it. I tried to calculate quarterly Gini coefficients. And what I used in this exercise was data, basically sectoral data. Yeah? If possible, two-digit industry level, average wage, average employment. I added average unemployment benefits and average unemployed persons, average pensions, and average number of pensioners receiving pensions. Yeah? And with this help, I tried to calculate some type of a Gini coefficient, basically on a quarterly basis. And I wanted to see, okay, how what happened before and after the outbreak of the global financial crisis, basically. And there is all kinds of things going on, but grosso modo, one could say for most countries, not a lot changes before this black line and after that. Yeah. So partly, yeah, rather stable, maybe in some cases a falling even inequality figure with this type of Gini that I calculated here. Now I tried to see what was the impact of public policy in this respect, and hence I recalculated the Gini, but only on the private wage sector basis. So I excluded unemployed, I excluded pensioners, and I excluded those sectors that are traditionally public sectors. Yeah? And here one could see that basically in the private sector we see an increase of inequality basically before and after the crisis. Yeah? My interpretation was that the public sector was inequality reducing in this region, both before and after the crisis, but in different ways. Yeah? Before the crisis, it was a lot of transfers, social expenditures, and after the crisis, it's interesting. I would rather claim there was an counterintuitive, progressive austerity, so to speak. Especially wages, high wages in the public sector were cut. Yeah? And in that sense, inequality in many cases was actually reduced. or at least stabilized, while the private sector was just continuing to experience income inequality. Now back again to our scatter plots. We are now in the early boom period, early 2000s. Again, on the vertical axis, the Gini coefficient. On the horizontal axis, average real GDP growth. Things went finally to the positive in the region. All countries were experiencing partly quite high growth rates. It were especially those countries that had the huge drop, the initial drop in the beginning of the transition, that experienced the highest growth rates, the Baltics basically, but also Romania, Bulgaria. Again, those countries that had before and also afterwards the highest levels of inequality. I would argue, although obviously from this we can't draw any, these are correlations obviously, but I would argue that the high levels of inequality already experienced due to the massive drop in the initial phase was fostering the development of bubbles. Yeah? So from anecdotal evidence, we know from the Baltic states, for instance, that it was especially but maybe we have someone from the Baltic states who can confirm this, that it was especially the rich people in the Baltic states that were taking up credits and building their houses in the suburbia of the capital cities. And this was, so to speak, then reinforcing inequality. That would be my reading of this phase. Again, an excursion. What about wealth distribution? It would be great to have data for the Baltic states, but that is comparable. But so far, in terms of comparable data, this is the HFCS data, and there are only two countries from our region, Slovakia and Slovenia, which probably had not experienced a private housing bubble in that period. Here we see the share of, but still have an ownership society. Yeah? Here we see the share of households holding real estate by gross income quintiles. Data was collected somewhere 2008 to 2011. And I compare it to two archetypical European countries in terms of real estate holdings by households. So Austria, where half of the population is actually renting, private rent, social housing, cooperative housing, and only higher income groups have also massively real estate holdings. That is the blue line, and the gray line, Spain, where actually the whole population is in an ownership society, also cohorts with low income. They were actually almost forced to take credits and have their house owned. Slovakia and Slovenia, here in the golden lines, are more similar in that respect to Spain. Yeah? But I think, but the majority of those real estate holdings were not made necessarily in those cases by taking up credits, but by the initial privatization of national housing, which in many cases were just symbolic prices. This is reflected in the debt distribution. So this is the share of households holding mortgage debt, again by gross income quintiles. And here our two countries from the region are more similar, like Austria, where actually only upper class people actually take up credits for buying mortgage, while in Spain this is much higher in all quintiles. So this was an excursion on some of these wealth issues. There will be a new wave of HFCS where then also some of the Baltic states will be covered. Now back to our scatter plots. We are now at the boom peak period 2005-2008. Basically all countries were growing like crazy. A large part of this growth was foreign financed, hence here we have the average current account balance. All countries were in a current account deficit at that period of time. a very linear relationship. Those countries with the highest levels of inequality, Baltics, Bulgaria, Romania, with the highest current account deficits. And I would say this is not by chance. There is also an issue of the choice of the exchange rate system. These are exactly those countries that have a fixed exchange rate. Yeah. So they have basically completely euroized, one could argue. So there was no mechanism to smoothen these processes, to appreciate, if you wish, or depreciate later on. So I think that has also to do something about this. And then the dry out of international capital flows, the Great Recession, this is the averages for the period 2009-2012. Again, Gini against the average current account balance, and it is now more clearly than in the initial transition crisis phase that there is some kind of a U-shaped relationship in income inequalities and macro imbalances. So you had still some countries increasing indebtedness, and you had some countries, some of the Baltic countries, that had already started to, due to non-financiability of imports, basically, to contract consumption, and hence imports have current account surpluses. Those countries that had always basically a rather balanced current account, again, Czech Republic, Slovakia, with low income inequalities. Now, all these relationships I showed you before are more or less changing depending on which period one looks at. There is one figure that never changes, I would argue, and this is the relationship now and before between income inequality, or actually equity and manufacturing. Here on the horizontal we have now the average manufacturing gross value added in percent of GDP, this last period, 2009-2012. And we basically see there is a group of countries with rather high shares of manufacturing, with low income inequality, and a group of countries up there around Baltics, Croatia, Bulgaria, with high income inequality and very low shares of manufacturing. I think there are a number of issues why there might be some structural relationship between these two factors. One of them is, I think, the issue of collective bargaining and equity. It is probably much easier to organize collective bargaining where you have a lot of industrial capacities, and maybe vice versa. We see that kind of linear relationship with those countries with more collective bargaining, are also those countries with less income inequality, and the other way around. And finally, the level of income and equity, those countries with high GDP per capita are those countries, Slovenia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, with low levels of income inequality, and again, the others up there with rather high levels of inequality. I think there are some relationships which are also not by chance, but structural. So, in order to conclude, the inequality in the Central and Eastern European core is rather low. Northern, southern periphery, higher levels of inequality. Eastern periphery, even higher levels. And during the transition crisis, you had a strong output loss, mass unemployment, macro imbalances, and high inequality were correlated. The choice of the exchange rate regime, I think, is quite crucial here. In the periods of boom and bust, the inequality, I think, fostered bubbles, and imbalances were actually, again, cementing inequality. State intervention, to a certain extent, was compensating in this period. There is, as I said, a constant relationship equity and manufacturing, and that is related very much to social partnership and, in the end, income levels. So although from none of this direct causality relationship can obviously be established, my intrinsic model would come up with the following policy recommendations. So for those countries that have high inequality, low manufacturing sector, industrial policy that could include, for instance, strong public infrastructure investments, organized social partnership, also and especially if you do not have anymore your own monetary policy and exchange rate policy. Social partnership helps also to regulate the real exchange rate, and I think that is crucial and has repercussions for macro imbalances, and that again I think has also repercussions for the wealth of the economy and probably again back feeding into also issues of inequality in the economy. Okay, thank you for your attention.